Our story today is taken from the book of Numbers, chapter 21. Our setting is the desert of the Sinai Peninsula, where we find encamped a people called the Israelites. These are a people who were slaves not long ago in the land of Egypt, but God stepped in, defeated their oppressors, and brought them out of there with the promise of leading them to their own land, their own home, where they might live free. During the years that the Israelites wandered through the wilderness, an event took place recorded in Numbers 21. Namely, venomous snakes came into the camp and bit them, a bite which would prove fatal to many. When this happened, the Israelites approach Moses, their leader, and urge him to ask God for help. We can read this in verse 7. "Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. In response, God instructs Moses to make a snake figure and place it on a pole. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then, when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. Our story continues, and God keeps his promise. He gives the Israelites the home he said he would, and the people end up settling there. We can read about this in Joshua 21. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. Promises kept, a new home, a settled people. The future seems bright. But it would seem that Numbers 21 isn't the last we've heard of the bronze snake, because it crops up again in the book of 2 Kings. In the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. So, after the Israelites settle in this region called Canaan, there is a period where judges rule the people. And following that, a royal house is established, so the people are thereafter ruled by kings. The first being King Saul, followed by David, and so on. And the passage we just read mentions a king named Hezekiah. He is of the line of David. We are told that this Hezekiah did what was right. His list of actions include removing the high places, smashing the sacred stones, and cutting down the Asherah poles. Now these places and items are referring specifically to idolatry and the worship of other gods. Gods worshipped by neighboring peoples living in Canaan and then typically adopted by the Israelites. High places refers to the spots where civilians would build altars on which to sacrifice, particularly to gods such as Molech, who demanded child sacrifices. Both sacred stones and Asherah poles are also connected with worshipping Canaanite gods, namely the male god and the female god of fertility. Sacred stones in Hebrew called maseba literally means an erected thing. These stone pillars were sometimes literally in phallic form and were raised in honor of the male pagan deity. You can see here real archaeological remnants of these in the Near East. Similarly, Asherah poles were raised to the goddess Asherah, the female goddess of fertility. And so during the time when Hezekiah took the throne, the land of Judah would have had many of these places of idol worship. Set often on hills, there would be altars with raised stones and poles, asking the god and goddess to bring fertility to the worshippers, whether this meant fertility to the land or personal fertility in the form of bearing children. Of course, there was a desperate and tragic irony to this idolatry system, because not only were the Israelites praying to non-existent and false gods, but the cycle between the asking for children and then turning around and sacrificing those children to Molech conjures a particularly horrendous image of a conveyor belt-like slaughterhouse, promising its worshippers prosperity and abundance, while in reality leading to death in the end. No wonder God forbade these idols and worship of these gods. He didn't forbid them as part of some vanity exercise. Hezekiah uses his influence as king by leading the people to better things, by pulling down these altars and smashing these things. He pleases God and no doubt saved a fair few lives by doing so. But a specific detail in this cleansing process initiated by the king should stand out to us in verse 4. It said, "He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made." For up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. The bronze snake Moses made. Now there were 13 kings between David and Hezekiah, factoring in the time the Israelites spent in the desert, plus the era of judges which preceded kingly rule. There are several hundred years between the day of Moses and the time of Hezekiah. In fact, it's nearly 1,000 years. The bronze snake in Numbers 21, which God asked Moses to fashion and place on a pole in the wilderness, surely has no use anymore. The settled people are not suffering from a regular mass invasion of snakes. But we're told now that the Israelites had been burning incense to it. And this wasn't a one-time thing either, because the text says, up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. Up to that time, meaning from the time of Moses till the time of Hezekiah. Nearly 1,000 years the Israelites had been doing this. Now, we may ask, what's the big deal? It's just a bit of incense. But in those days, burning incense was not referring to merely making some smoky potpourri, nor was it the same as how some Westerners today have repurposed incense burning from Eastern influences, merely for the smell or during some meditation. The burning of incense back then was an act directly connected with prayers, and asking for forgiveness of sins as part of those prayers. In fact, the first mention of burning incense in Israel's history is found in Exodus 25, and it is only expressly to be used in the context of the tabernacle service. Now, just so we're all on the same page, the tabernacle refers to the tent in which God came to live in. He lived among his people in the Sinai desert. His presence was there, traveling with them, and people could go there and ask for help, forgiveness, and pray. As part of the tabernacle service, there was something called the altar of incense. We find mention of it in Exodus 30. This was a square altar, one that the people could see. It was placed in front or just outside the compartment where God himself sat. Burning incense on this altar served as a visual symbol to the people of their prayers for help reaching God. This was symbolized by the smoke of the incense. The priest would burn a sacrifice, so burn incense, and the smoke of it would travel from the altar through the veil and into what was called the most holy place, the section of the tent where God was. It served as a very real image and message to the people that when they ask for forgiveness, when they pray to God, it reaches him. That whenever someone prays, he hears them. That this God is not some God far away, up in heaven or beneath the earth, who cannot be reached by our thoughts and needs. And, on top of that, the thing which was burned on the altar of incense was the sacrifice. An animal sacrifice symbolizing the cost it takes for God to be close to humanity. And so as we can see, burning incense to someone or something was no small deal in Israel, but had great symbolic and historical meaning attached to it. And so if Israelites since the time of Moses until Hezekiah are burning incense to this bronze snake figurine, it means that they are praying to it. It means they are likely sacrificing to it. As we said, burning incense in those days didn't mean they are lighting the tips of some incense sticks they bought in their local store. That is what modern incense is. No, it meant they are making sacrifices to it and burning the sacrifices, thus producing the incense smoke. This also means they are asking this figure for some form of help and forgiveness of sins. In fact, this practice had developed into a cult, a snake cult in Jerusalem, a cult built around the worship of this object. Semantic scholars such as Karen Randolph-Joines demonstrate that the snake cult in Jerusalem was in fact not unique in its utilization of the bronze serpent as an idol. At least 7 such snakes have been today found in various pre-Israelite surrounding cities, meaning that the symbol of a snake as an idol wasn't a new thing. Other peoples living in Canaan had been worshipping such idols for years. But, of course, one might argue, the Israelites had real cause to revere this object, because they had a certain experience with this particular bronze snake, didn't they? They may have thought, yes, God has forbidden us from worshipping other images and idols, but this is different. For one, it was God himself who instructed Moses to create it. It was God himself who told our ancestors to look to it for healing when they'd been bitten by snakes. And when they looked, didn't it work? Weren't they in fact healed? That's what our history says. The bronze snake had, in fact, been the object used for their forefathers' healing and forgiveness those many years ago. So surely this particular idol was different. It had imbued meaning and power. We mentioned that snake idols were not a new Israelite invention, but that it was found in other people's cultures in Canaan. On top of that, the Israelites in the Sinai desert in the days of Moses would have carried with them associations with snakes from where they were coming from too, from Egypt. Serpents were seen by Egyptian rulers as symbols of life, healing, and protection. Deities and kings were often pictured with uri, serpent heads on their foreheads, or otherwise pictures in association with protective uri. The image of a protective uraeus would have made sense to the newly freed slaves, just leaving Egypt. They'd seen the serpent on Pharaoh's crown, on the hieroglyphics they painted on Egyptian walls. This image would have made sense to them. And all these reasonings and associations would have fueled the snake cult in Jerusalem, which was still alive and kicking, of course, in the time of Hezekiah. In fact, many of the royal officials in Judah made use of the winged uraeus in seals and seal impressions, of which archaeological artifacts still exist today. Suffice to say, the image of the snake being connected with healing and protection was prevalent in Israel's Egyptian past, wilderness wandering past, the cultures which surrounded them, and presently in the form of the snake cult in Jerusalem. So the question bears asking, if God had told his people not to worship any idol or any other thing than him, Why on earth would he ask Moses to make a snake on a pole? And why would he ask those bitten by snakes to look at it for healing in the first place? After all, it seems rather absurd to be asked to stare at an image of the very thing that's killing you in order to heal you, to be presented with a solution that takes shape of the problem. Doesn't asking snake-bitten people to look at a snake to be healed feel almost like mockery or irony or merely strange? The answer lies in understanding a few things, beginning with the use of symbols. A symbol is a thing that represents or stands for something else, especially a material object representing something abstract. Symbolism is the use of symbols to represent ideas or qualities. So often a physical material thing that can be perceived and interpreted by our senses, representing a larger unseen and perhaps abstract meaning or force. Human beings are drawn to symbols. From the beginning, we have sought meaning behind the plain, attaching great religious, existential, emotional meaning to the things we see around us, seeking patterns in the world and the larger significance behind the perceivable. If it were not so, we wouldn't have poetry, art, metaphors, stories, language, math. Yes, even math. As much as some may like to claim that math is the universal objective language and absolute truth, even numbers themselves are symbols. What is the number 5? It is a symbolic representation of an amount. 1 symbolizes a unit of something. The signs of plus, minus, and divide represent the relationship between 2 or more quantities. 1 in itself isn't a thing, but we attach meaning to it to communicate something. 1 is a symbol. Similarly, what is a flag? When you see your national flag waving in the wind, it may rouse all sorts of feelings: pride, shame, courage, apathy. People have fought and died under flags, and yet what is a flag? A piece of cloth dyed with a few colors, bearing a few shapes. And yet such a symbol can represent information, a long shared history, generations of oppression, ideological allegiance, a cause considered worth your life, perhaps. The point here is that symbols are powerful things, but not in and of themselves. The object itself holds no real power, but the attached meaning can. Now, God consistently used symbolism to communicate with his people. The biblical story is rife with symbols in the language God uses, in the building of the tabernacle tent, in the sacrificing of animals, when Jesus tells parables. God's use of symbols to communicate great truths to his people weren't, as sometimes has been wrongly assumed, an attempt to keep them in the dark or to maintain his own mystical quality, to not communicate clearly or to put distance between himself and human beings. But let us ask ourselves this question: how does an all-wise God communicate to creatures concepts in the universe that are larger than their mental capacity, than their nature, their perspective, their intelligence, their present understanding, or even willingness to listen? Notice how Jesus spoke to his disciples about his kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like. He says this phrase again and again. The introduction to his parables: the kingdom of heaven is like this. It's a bit like this, or a bit like that, like a seed, like a pearl, like yeast rising in dough. How was an infinite mind to explain something so incredibly vast, absolutely good, and infinite as his rulership? to describe using the constraints and limitations of human language what it's like living under him as king. Even for us, when we are asked to explain love or grief, have we not for thousands of years turned to poetry to do so, to music and art? Love is a thing so vast that we depend on symbolism to try to explain and express it, and we try again and again in 1,000 ways. So God's use of symbols when communicating things about himself, about salvation, about life and death to his people, is not some coy attempt to evade precision. He is using symbols as a translator, translating the infinite genius into the relatable, into something that we can understand on some level, something we can, as Paul wrote, glimpse through a glass darkly. So, this is the first thing to understand about symbolism. Humans relate to symbols. God uses the language of symbols to communicate things to his people that they can get some sense of what he's doing, of what his intentions are, and of who he is. But then there's a second layer to it, the specific symbols he happens to choose. Now, if you've heard the biblical story from a young age, the common repeated symbols therein may seem like a normality, may seem obvious, like a second language you don't even notice you're using anymore. Yes, of course we say sheep represent God's people. Of course Jesus is the lamb. The word of God is of course a sword or a lamp. Bread and wine is the body of Christ. Of course that all makes sense. But does it? It doesn't automatically make sense. Not without the context. Not without the story. But it's become familiar to us. In the movie Gandhi, a white man called Charlie travels on a train through India. As was customary for many passengers to do, he's invited to climb out of the train window and up onto the roof of the train. There sit many passengers. A local spots Charlie, clearly seeing he's a foreigner, and wishes to make him feel welcome. "Are you a Christian, Sahib?" he asks. Charlie says, Yes, I'm a Christian." The Indian man replies proudly, "I know a Christian. She drinks blood." Charlie stares at him in surprise, not knowing what to say. The Indian man continues, "The blood of Christ, every Sunday." Christian symbolism heard by someone who is not familiar with the attached meaning sounds, in fact, rather absurd. And something as seemingly innocuous as communion makes Christianity sound like a cannibalistic vampire cult. The Indian man was in fact very tolerant in being so kind to these apparent white vampires who drink their god's blood once a week. The point here is, it is context which makes symbols relatable or not. The context is made up of culture, history, education, experience. If you are a Westerner, it is easy to forget that most of the symbols God used when communicating with people in the Bible stories we know so well was molded to their context. It was aimed at making sense in their culture. It used objects and everyday things in a Near Eastern ancient world to make great mysteries relatable. The key word here being relatable. Which tells us something. Not only is God willing to use symbolism, he chooses relatable symbolism for his people in their present situation, culture, geography, language. And when we realize this, suddenly the use of a snake on a pole for healing begins to make more sense. Because how would the Israelites have seen this? What would this symbol communicate to them? Well, we've already alluded to this. They'd seen the use of snake symbols in Egypt where they were just coming from. Pharaoh wore it on his crown. The Egyptians connected the symbol with healing, life, and protection. The Israelites had spent their whole lives steeped in that Egyptian culture and understanding. Similarly, not only is there this meaning attached to snakes in the land they're coming from, but also in the land they're going to. The surrounding peoples and cultures in Canaan also looked to the image of the snake for forgiveness, healing, and help in the form of idols. One of the reasons God chooses the snake on the pole to communicate a concept to his people is that it is relatable and familiar and translatable in their past, present, and as we will soon discover, their future. Now the question then becomes, in Numbers 21, God asked his people to look to this symbol in faith in order to be healed. Why then would it be so bad that they continue to look to this symbol for healing in the coming years? What was the big deal about them praying to and burning incense to the snake? After all, it was a tool chosen by God. This is where we come to the matter of superstition versus trust. Superstition is defined as a widely held but irrational belief in supernatural influences, especially as leading to good or bad luck, or a practice based on such a belief. It can also be described as a way of behaving that is based on fear of the unknown and faith in magic or luck. The core of superstition is anchored in control. It is the belief that you as a human can somehow manipulate greater spiritual forces to make things work in your favor. Say the right words, make the right sacrifices, do the right dance, and you will bend the will of spirits and gods and the forces of the universe into having an allegiance to you or helping you out. Of course, from a biblical worldview, superstition is not merely about control, it is a delusion of control. It is considered delusional that human beings have any powers over forces greater than themselves. In fact, by default, this wouldn't work, because if you have power over something, how can it be more powerful than you? God never asked his people to practice superstition. Instead, he invited them to experience faith, or better put, trust. Sometimes these two things, superstition and faith, get mixed up. Even today, these two opposite ways of relating to God and higher powers are confused for each other. So, if, as we said, superstition is about the attempt and delusion of control, then what is trust about? Trust is a belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. In this context, it's about trusting in God's ability and will to help, to do what we can't do, and to keep his promises. Now, trust in a person is built over time. As they demonstrate what their values are, show you that they're reliable, that they keep their word and follow through, over time people reveal their characters, what they're about and who they really are. And this is where the narrative in Numbers 21 reveals yet another layer to this story. God asks the Israelites bitten by snakes to look at the serpent on the pole, not because it was some test or exercise in proving themselves, or hoop they had to jump through to qualify for healing. Not because it was an act of superstition, say the magic words and I shall comply. No, looking to the snake on the pole was a sign of consent. Anyone who wanted God's healing, his forgiveness, his help, could symbolically signal their consent by looking at this snake. Even in the process of healing his people, God is showing them, teaching them something about himself, that he values their free will, and that trusting in him has to do with consent and not control. This is who they're being invited to trust in, a deity who protects and values their consent. That's what we're being asked to have faith in. That's the kind of relationship he's inviting all people into. A relationship where consent and freedom aren't held under duress, where the free gift of help doesn't need to be earned through a series of tedious performances and pageantry. Consent is a cornerstone to true relational trust. Without it, it's just holding good things hostage. The final layer to the beauty behind God using this snake on a pole to heal his people has to do with foolishness. Foolish things. If we look again at Numbers 21, asking a snake-bitten people to look at a snake in order to be healed sounds pretty foolish. We already asked the question, why use the image of the problem to solve the problem? It seems like nonsense, like foolishness. And the truth is, this is not the first time God uses seemingly foolish things to do great and meaningful things. Later on, Paul even states this outright in his first letter to the Corinthian church. He writes, "But God has chosen the foolish things of the world that he might shame the wise, and God chose the weak things of the world that he might shame the strong." Now, is the idea here that this particular God enjoys the unwise and the ineffective? No. The ending of that thought is, he chose the lowly and despised things of the world and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one can boast in his presence. You find this theme repeating itself over and over again in stories in both the Old and New Testament. If a situation seems impossible, God almost makes it more impossible to prove that what he's doing is not done through the strength, the seeming wisdom and capability and power wielded by men. It's him driving the point home. If God promises that he will rain fire from heaven to light Elijah's altar, he instructs Elijah to douse the altar in buckets of water. If God is going to call a people, it will be the descendants of an old couple who cannot have children. If God himself will become a human being and be born on earth, let it be to a virgin. God is communicating, so that there's no doubt that I'm doing this impossible thing, that you can trust me to do impossible things. Let me stress the point of impossibility by using what people consider foolish, weak, incapable, dismissible, lowly, despised, and non-existent. And if there's any theories about it being man-made or man-achieved, the way through which it's done puts those thoughts to rest. Basically, no one can boast about it. No one will be able to boast that they made it happen. God sometimes uses foolish things, absurd things, almost as a way to demonstrate that it's not the thing itself. It's almost like an anti-superstition lesson, that it's not humanity's wielding of the thing itself that is doing the impossible. To put to bed any ideas about superstition, instead, he's communicating that he's worthy of our trust. It is him doing it. It is his power, his ability, his choice that is doing it. And that it is not a thing which we can control, but a thing in which we can put our trust. And this is where we come to King Hezekiah. As he takes the throne nearly 1,000 years after Moses' days, he demonstrates in 2 Kings that he understands this. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan, which in Hebrew means a brazen thing, or a mere piece of brass. For all these years the Israelites missed that the bronze snake in the desert had been merely a symbol, and that it was God, not the snake, that had cured them. It had been an invitation to consent and they had turned it into an object of control. The bronze snake had been a tool which God had used and didn't have any power in itself. In order to deliver the people from their infatuation with this thing and impress them with the idea of its worthlessness, Hezekiah called it, in contempt, Nehushtan, meaning a mere piece of brass. Just a lump of bronze, just a thing. It's him saying to the people, it's just a thing. After the bronze snake is smashed to pieces, we might assume that it would be the last time we hear of it. But lo and behold, 700 years later, it crops up again in the story, and it is referenced by none other than Jesus. In John chapter 3, a Pharisee steals quietly through the Judean night. He's coming to speak with Jesus in secret. Many of his religious order condemns Jesus, but Nicodemus is captured by Jesus' teachings and wishes to speak more to him. During their conversation that night, Jesus talks about his kingdom, about being born again, how the Spirit of God moves. To do so, he makes use of imagery and symbolism. And then in verse 14, he says the following: "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that everyone who believes in him may have eternal life." And it is after this verse that we find perhaps one of the most famous Bible verses of all. "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." Jesus connects himself with the story in Numbers 21. When he uses the phrase, the Son of Man, he's referring to himself. And he's talking here about his crucifixion. How soon he too will be raised up, hanging between heaven and earth on a wooden pole or cross. And he says, just like the snake was raised, and those who looked on it in trust were healed, so those who look at me will be healed. The symbol of a snake on a pole being associated with healing stuck so well that even today this is the symbol used for hospitals and medical aid. And I often think about Jesus' words in John 3 when browsing through a clothing store. Particularly a few years ago, it was very fashionable to have large crosses printed on clothing, a fashion that comes and goes, along with things like cross necklaces. An Archbishop of Canterbury once remarked that the cross fashion trend trivializes the cross. He went on to state that modern fashion has robbed the cross of power. But let us now apply everything we've learned today about symbols and God's use of them and ask, is that true? Jesus connected his cross with the story in Numbers 21. And if he is making that deliberate connection, what might we conclude about how to think about the cross symbol? If we may summarize, in Numbers 21, God uses the very image of what's killing his people as a symbol for how he's healing them, the great irony. He uses the foolish things of the world to underline the impossibility of what he's doing, and how we can therefore trust him to do the impossible. God told his people that if you look at this raised snake, you will be healed. Jesus says that he too will be raised, and that those who look in trust to his execution stake will be healed of their permanent death. The cross was the tool of death used by the oppressive Roman Empire. It symbolized death and human violence. God is taking this empirical death tool and turning it into a symbol of life. He is repurposing evil's tools into doing his good. And consent was a cornerstone in the healing in Numbers 21. Jesus says those who look to me in trust will be healed. They are signaling their consent, allowing me and what I promise to do save them. and ultimately heal them of their violence. Now the symbol, the emblem of a cross, is it magic in itself? Can the symbol itself heal us, save us from the death we've made? No. Just like the snake on the pole couldn't do a thing in itself. Wearing a cross necklace, crossing oneself, surrounding oneself with the image of a cross in one's home and churches doesn't create this protective shield against harm, nor does saying the right words, making the right sacrifices, the right prayer. The cross, just like the bronze snake, was merely a tool. A cross in itself is not some lucky charm, nor is it supernatural. If we act as though it is, we are simply falling into the same trap as the Israelites. The symbol of the cross can bring us neither luck nor blessing. 2 pieces of wood doesn't save anyone. The person who used it does that. God repurposed the symbol of human violence and oppression at the time of Jesus and turned it into a symbol of life. God uses the foolish things of the world. It does seem foolish to use an instrument of death to represent the promise of life, but God repurposes relatable things, foolish things, dead things for His wise purposes. Let us not turn His wise purposes back into foolishness by worshipping the things itself. Symbols of our faith are empty until He uses them. Only then are they meaningful or impactful in the context of His active involvement. And when the symbols of our faith become the objects of our faith, we turn them into idols. Even symbols, which were originally meant for good, can become harmful to us if misapplied. We misapply them when we replace trust with superstition, replacing trusting in God's ability and will alone to help us with our delusions of control. Symbolism becomes idolatry when the symbols are placed in a role they can never rightfully fill. And turning symbols into idols cause us to betray both ourselves and the very thing they were symbolizing in the first place. Let us today consider our relationship to symbols, the symbols in our lives, in our faith, in our churches, in our ideology. Have we made them into more than they should be? Has superstition crept into our trust, into our relationships to religious imagery, baptism, communion, prayer, worship, flags? Do our symbols point us to God, or do we give them a role they could never succeed at filling? Do we take foolish things, which God in the past and the present used impossibly for good, and wrongfully aim our allegiance and trust at them instead? Let us be reminded of a God who is so humble, He's willing to use relatable, imperfect, finite language and imagery to communicate with us. A God who centers relationship and consent in His offer of healing and help. And a God who assures us that He can do the impossible by turning death and foolishness and violence back on itself. May our trust not be hijacked in the service of symbols, but be redirected to the God using them. And if we have wrongfully aimed our trust, prayers, and hopes at the foolish things, may we be reminded of the story of the snake on a pole in Numbers 21, and like King Hezekiah, declare them to be Nehushtan, mere brazen things.